Welcome to Connecting with Coincidence with psychiatrist Bernard David Beitman, MD. Dr. Beitman is the founder of the Coincidence Project. The project encourages people like you to tell each other coincidence stories. To learn more about Dr. Beitman's work, put Connecting with Coincidence in your web browser. You'll find his book, his Psychology Today blog, and the interviews from this podcast. And now your host, Bernard Beitman, MD.
Welcome to Connecting with Coincidence. I am your host, Bernard Beitman, MD. Yes, I'm a psychiatrist who still does psychotherapy. I study meaningful coincidences like synchronicity and serendipity because many of them are very useful and their possible explanations provide clues about how reality works. You can order my book through any place you get your books. Please consider going to your local bricks and mortar bookstore. My coincidence for today is a seriality one, which is a series of events that are objective in the outside world and not dependent on correlations with mental events. The Coincidence Project is intended to increase public awareness and use of meaningful coincidence. Our research arm will start with the search for patterns in the many coincidences we have collected. A common pattern is being in the right place at the right time, and there are many others described in my book, Meaningful Coincidences, but we may have missed some. So we plan to use artificial intelligence to find some of these hidden patterns. For example, a visitor to my house in Charlottesville, Virginia, knows someone who works at OpenAI, where this project may find a home. Following his visit, I found in the media 3 other references to OpenAI, one on a medical website, one in a newsletter, and the third as I was waiting to be on a London-based radio show. The guest before me was talking about advances in AI and mentioned OpenAI. So how are you supposed to interpret these things? Well, I took it as the hints that I'm on the right path with this OpenAI thing. And I just sent out a couple emails to see what will happen with those. Well, our guest today is the none other than Whitley Strieber, who I am so delighted that he will join me on this podcast. Whitley is the author of Communion and many other books. His most recent are Afterlife Revolution, A New World, and A New World with Jesus, and A New World, and Jesus, A New Vision. His next title is Them. I kind of remember an old science fiction movie called that. Them.
Right.
You remember that one too?
Oh yeah, that's why part of the reason I've titled my book Them.
Because you tap into the resonance with already cultural ideas.
Well, yeah, and the whole way that the fears that are evoked in the movie are the fears that we all live with in our attempts to make sense of what I call the visitor phenomenon, others call aliens and so forth. But so there are quotes from the movie scattered throughout the book.
Oh, I love intuition. I love coming up with stuff like that. So that connects even further. So besides them, there's us, you and me right here. So let's get into talking a little bit about coincidences and you. How important are coincidences in your life, Whitley?
Well, the important thing in my life is noticing them because they usually have significance, and I have they're easily bypassed if you're living your life and you notice a coincidence flying past. It's important often to take notice of that, and easy not to. Can give you an example if you want me to, of one that happened the day before yesterday. In them, one of the things I'm writing about is what is becoming an increasingly common phenomenon of people seeing these strange people, if they are people, walking down the street. And this is something that I've talked about before because the one of the editors at William Morrow and Company, the company that originally published Communion, in 1988 had an extraordinary experience with this. He was a military intelligence officer who had retired and become a military history editor at the publishing company, and they had just published Communion. He had wanted to, they were all looking in bookstores to see if it was moving because it was very important to them. And he went into a bookstore in Manhattan, broad daylight, and with his wife, and saw two people looking through the book, which was on display in the store. So he walked up to them, and they were paging through it very quickly and laughing, and unfortunately for me. And one of them looked up at him, and he realized he was looking into these big black eyes, and that it was not a human being. And of course, he was shocked out of his wits. And he told his wife, went to his wife and said, "We've got to leave the store." And so they left with these two individuals walking along behind them, still laughing and chatting about the book. And he watched them go off down the street in their coats and hats. Nobody gave him a second glance. Then I received a call from my editor at William Morrow and Company, Jim Landis, and said, "Whitley, we've got good news and bad news." I said, "Oh God, Jim, tell me the bad news first." And he said, "The visitors think your book is ridiculous." And I thought, they don't even believe in the visitors at William Morrow and Company. They're just selling books. They've made that very clear to me. He said, "But the good news is we know they're real now." And then he told me the story. Okay. Fast forward to day before yesterday. I walk into a store to buy a birthday present for somebody whose birthday happens to be on December the 19th. And I'm buying it. And the lady, I've never been in the store before, and she wants information, because it's an expensive gift, and she'd like to know her customers. So I give her my name and email and so forth. And she says, "You're Whitley Strieber?" I said, "Well, I was, at least until a few minutes ago."
Last I heard, yeah.
And then I say, she says, I've had something happen to me. Now, I hear this an enormous amount, as you may imagine. But what then she said was very surprising. She said, "I was in a store, not on her store, but another store, and someone walked past the door, and the person with me said, 'That's not a human being.' And I looked out, and this very tiny person was walking along and had very long arms all the way down to their knees and a quite big head. And I thought to myself, it doesn't look like a human being to me either." And she went out and stopped the person and said, "Excuse me, could you give me the time?" Now, the creepy thing happened was this individual pulled out a cell phone, and the homepage on it, where you have a picture of your grandchildren or your wife or whatever, husband, had a picture of a human fetus on it. It's pretty scary in a way. And this individual held the phone up so that she could see the time on it, and then put it back in their pocket and walked on. And she said to herself, and then also to her friend in the store, "That was not a human being. You're right." Now, what makes this an extraordinary coincidence is I'm working on this new book. You mentioned it, Them. I had just stopped working for that day, 10 minutes before I walked into the store and heard this story about that very type of situation happening to people more and more lately. And literally, just a few minutes had passed between the time I was writing about it and the time this happened. Now, I consider that quite a coincidence, and I think it's a meaningful coincidence. But what does it mean? That's the question. Does it mean that this is an important part of the book? Well, I would think so. But how did it work? Bernard, I think your work is so wonderful because that's exactly what you explore.
Yes. And what does it mean? And you start first with how it felt to you emotionally.
No, right.
And
Yeah,
it felt, how did it feel to you emotionally, Whitley?
surprising.
What?
Surprising.
Surprise.
Now, the idea that the person was holding a phone with a human fetus as the homepage was definitely creepy. Because when you get into the close encounter experience, it's a lot of it is about disappearing pregnancies and stuff like that. So that significantly creeped me out.
And it correlated. It may creep you out, but it correlated with what you are so involved with.
Absolutely, it did. It did correlate with what I was involved with, and in one way, it suggested to me that perhaps I'm right to be concerned about this business, because do we really want this strange presence to be penetrating into our lives that in such a way that it affects our sexuality and our procreation? I really don't know.
You really don't know. Here you are since 1980 and well before, having had many close encounters of the third kind.
Yeah. Well, I will say, let me be very clear here. I don't want these sexual encounters to involve us being exploited in some way, especially not in the context of children being born in situations that we are not in control of. No.
And you do have personal evidence that that happens.
No, I wouldn't say I have personal evidence that that happens. I have personal evidence that there are some very strange people around here. Yes. But we've all got evidence.
I got plenty of that too. Yeah.
Yeah. But, well, yeah, as a psychiatrist, you certainly must. But
no, we're going past that strangeness of psychiatry. We're going to the black eyes that you saw in the bookstore in Manhattan.
Well, I didn't see those. Yeah, but go ahead.
Isn't that what you said? You saw the black eyes?
No, an editor from William Morrow and Company
saw the black.
I saw them before in the context of the abduction that happened to me in December of 1985. Yes.
So what you're asking, I think, is what does it mean to humanity to have these entities that visit you and many, many other people that you know and hear about? What does it mean to have them among us? You're asking that question.
In a sense, but in this context of this show, the question becomes, why are there so many coincidences connected with the experience? Because I live in an ocean of coincidences.
Yes.
They're connected with this. They never stop. And is it that you're seeing something of the weave of the universe under the surface when you're engaging in these things or not? I don't know.
Well, let's take the picture of you in the center of a web, which in a way we all probably are. Indra's net is a very good metaphor, but you're a jewel in a web somehow. That's Whitley Strieber's mind is in this web of visitors. You think about it, you've been with it, you've experienced it, people tell you stories. So there's something about your mind that's focused on this particular subject that's also attracts people or non-people or like people and stories that are the ones that you are experiencing and know about and write about.
Yes.
I experience lots of coincidences myself of a variety of kinds, so that what you describe about writing something and then it happens in the store that you're visiting happens to me pretty regularly, where I'm reading something that I'm writing about. I'm reading a novel and there it is, like simulpathity is one of my ideas of feeling the pain of a loved one at a distance. And there I am reading a novel where it's a variation on simulpathity the same day I'm thinking about writing a Psychology Today post on that subject. There's something about our minds that are connected to the content that we're most interested in, and reflects, I think, for both of us, that our minds are not as separate from our environment as we are being told. You think about close encounters, you are deeply immersed in understanding them, and they are part of your mind, both internal and external.
Now, this idea of the mind external
Yes.
is completely denied by a vast cross section of Western society.
Yeah.
Completely. And those who don't, even those who don't deny it, don't live as if it's real, because they live as if they are isolated inside themselves.
Yes.
But these coincidences are telling us something different, I think.
They are.
I wonder what the mechanism is, or there's an energy of some kind that we're tapped into, perhaps, that we don't acknowledge.
Well, before we try to get into how it happens, it's so important scientifically to say that it happens, and to hear your mind and actually visualize it as you're describing it in this web of visitors in various ways reflects what I'm doing. So our minds are parallel in the what we're studying, that we see what's outside inside, and what's inside we see outside. Once we establish that, that's a fundamentally important lesson of coincidences, that the mind external and the mind internal are very much connected with each other. That's first. I have some ideas about how that might work, but first, to establish it, what's the significance of that mind external to you?
I think it's more significant to me than the mind internal. It's where I live, really, and where I get information. I have a meditation practice that involves meditating at in the wee hours of the morning every night, which is a period of time called, in some yoga traditions, a Brahma Muhurta time, which is the time of learning and when I meditate during that time, I get information that usually I use in my work, in my books. Every book I've written from Afterlife Revolution on has worked this way. And coincidence is absolutely integral to the whole thing, in the sense that if I need something, some information, it will fall into my hands if I just let it, every time. And this is why the research in, like, for example, Jesus and New Vision runs so deep, because I can do this, and I can. It's not that it's not coming in to like a download, as they call them, but rather what will happen will be, I'll think about something I need, some information that I need, or some question I need answered. And the next thing I know, a day or so later, that literally falls into my hands.
Could you give us an example about how that has happened with you?
Sure. When I was starting to think, I'll give you an example from that book about.
Which book? I'm sorry.
Jesus and New Vision. Okay. This is among other things, it's a retelling of the story of Jesus's life. And part of it has to do with his childhood, which is completely unknown. And I thought to myself, is it completely unknown or not? I couldn't find a thing about it anywhere, not even any speculation. And then suddenly I found myself looking at an apocryphal gospel called the Infancy Gospel of Jesus, which I hadn't even known existed before. It showed up without any significant, I mean, it showed up on Google, and I had been looking for Jesus' childhood and hadn't seen anything. And then suddenly, when I wasn't looking for Jesus' childhood, here was this Infancy Gospel of Jesus, and I read it, and it was fairly absurd. Talking about all these miracles and kids getting pushed off of roofs and all sorts of bizarre things. And I thought to myself, well, I can well understand why this isn't in the canon, because it looks like a fantasy. But then I thought to myself, wait a minute. If you strip away all of the fantastic parts of this, then it's not a fantasy at all. These are family stories about a very unusual child and a very brilliant child. That's what this is. That's where it started. Someone knew Jesus's family stories and embellished them with all kinds of miracles to make him look like a god. You strip away all of that stuff, and what you have is the most complete depiction of a childhood anywhere in literature from then up until the 19th century.
Wow.
And you have this marvelous document. And it would never have come to me without the coincidence and of happening to find it when I did, and without knowing how I did it, and the insight that came from the 3 a.m. meditation that enabled me to think about just stripping away all of the fiction and leaving only the raw story of this little boy, very brilliant, very easily angered because he was so brilliant in a world that was very dim indeed. And there you have it. And so I was able to produce in my book the only description of of Jesus as a child that exists anywhere in the world.
The research project I've been involved with shows that needing information shows up in various ways: media, overhearing other people talking, books, newspapers. It shows up when you need it. And what you added was being in the right place at the right time, that you were there on the Google to be able to find it, but you didn't know how you got there. And that I call human GPS or internal GPS. So
Exactly.
what you're describing are basic common coincidence patterns here, but they're not in the hands of an ordinary human being. They're in
well, maybe not.
Excuse me, you're not an ordinary human being, Whitley, because of the way I feel in my heart about you and the fact that you look like my best friend from high school make you at least non-ordinary to me.
Oh, well, good. I hope you considered your best friend from high school not too funny looking.
He's a great looking guy.
Well, thank you.
You're welcome. And I just was figuring out I was watching you. So you have been able to take what are standard coincidence patterns and take your information at 3 a.m. where you learn, where you were somehow instructed or advised, or however you want to say it, to strip away the fantasy to find what was real there. You needed to get that information too to make this thing happen. So you have a particular way of, let me say, augmenting your coincidences with your 3 a.m. study habits.
Right. Making use of them, I would think.
Making use of them. Yes. Now that is a wonderful new idea for me in a way, is to be able to be constructively seeking through standard pattern that you use that to find out new information, how to use a coincidence that you experience. And that's what you were able to do in the middle of the night.
I met a comedian, a very famous man called Bob Hope many years ago.
Oh, come on. Yes.
Yeah, he was very interested in UFOs.
Oh, he was.
He was. If you look at his house out in Palm Springs and here in California, it looks like a big UFO. But it was a private interest. It wasn't he didn't make a big deal of it publicly, but he did. I ended up seeing him and spending an hour or so with him out there at one point.
It must have been fun.
It was really fun, yeah. He was, because I considered him quite a wonderful man, and I said to him, "How did you do this? I mean, how did you become Bob Hope? You're one of the most famous people in the world, and you've done it just literally a world of good." And he said, "Oh, the truth, I just let it happen." And I thought to myself, letting it happen, being present to the opportunities that are offered you, it's such a good lesson.
It is.
Because he basically, when the door opened, he walked through it, and he became this extraordinary presence in the 20th century, and also told a few pretty good jokes.
Sure did.
Yeah.
And how does that letting it happen apply to you and your work, Whitley?
I'm still working on it because I have a tendency to go for it rather than let it happen. And you have to put yourself. You can't sit in a room all by yourself, which is something I love to do, and also let it happen. Because you don't come into contact with the world, then nothing's going to happen for you.
That's a fundamental coincidence principle, that you have to be out there running around so you get various stimuli coming into you, especially if you're running around in a fairly unstructured environment. You increase the likelihood of meeting your mind outside of yourself.
Yeah, precisely. And I've been doing much more traveling in part for that reason. And yeah, I want to go. I haven't traveled much in my life. I've traveled a lot, but not to places like Egypt or Greece or Turkey or any of those wonderful places with so much magic in them. I've mostly traveled to, on author tour and so forth and things like that. And you don't tend to be sort of exposed to the possibility of meaningful coincidences so much.
Right.
Well, that's not always true, of course.
It's not always true. Sometimes within the structure, there's a lot of potential movement, as you do at 3 a.m. each day.
Yeah.
But structure generally inhibits the coincidence possibility.
That's not only do I agree with you, that's also wise advice and a good thing for me to hear, for anyone to hear, because it's really true. You have to be kind of open-ended in order to let the coincidence happen. Like Bob Hope said, I just let it happen.
Well, I heard that Oprah Winfrey's husband says he can't let it happen. He's really got to take over his life. And my reaction was, when you're married to her, you got to take some control too. Yeah. There is an illusion of one or the other, of polarities. And in order to be writing a book, as you have done many times and are doing still, you can't help it. I know how that feels. You just got to do it. That you've got to be able to go on a sine wave of like letting it happen and then structuring and letting it happen and structuring. A sine wave is a fundamental element of the way the universe works. Spirals and energy patterns, those are all normal curves to some degree. And that's what we have here, is the being able to smoothly go between the polarities of letting it happen. Oh man, okay, going for it, like on the dance floor, and then grabbing what you've learned and being able to put it down on paper?
The being open in that way, even while you're working, is terribly important.
Very important.
Very important, because you have to, and you have to also, in my experience, you have to be willing to take curveballs that are thrown at you.
Give us a curve. Give us a curveball.
Okay. Let me see. All right. I was working on them just recently, and it involves two parts. Basically, the theme of the book is an attempt to build a picture of the personality, policies, and objectives of whatever this presence is that is here.
Wow.
Yeah. Well, I always like to start. I start a book. When I start a book, I always like to start with something that seems to be impossible. Otherwise, why do it? I mean, why, if you're not going to advance anything, what's the point? So
that's great. That's great. I like to hear that, because I got some less crazy ideas, maybe, or more. I don't know, that we are all part of a mental atmosphere is what I am trying to be able to say. Mind and environment is a way of talking about that. We share a mind with our environment. We share a mind with nature and each other. And let's face it, ladies and gentlemen, and let's do something with it.
I think that's a very important idea to have in your head, because it's not an idea so much as it is a recognition. And if you live with this recognition in your head, you're going to get a much richer life in terms of, for example, things like doing research. But anyway,
curveball time.
Yeah, the first part of them is an analysis of 10 close encounter experiences that we received in when after communion was written. We received thousands and thousands of letters of people describing things that had happened to them. And those are, by the way, all now archived at Rice University in Texas. But
good old Jeff.
Yeah, good old Jeff Kreifel. He's the one, boy. His new book, Super Humanities, by the way, is a work of genius. It's absolutely fabulous. In any case, the second part of it is about the military experience, which is a very important aspect of it, and it's quite hidden for two reasons. The first reason is that they operate according to the principle of pencils up. When they're working on stuff like this, they don't keep notes. So from generation to generation, the latest generation loses what the last generation knew, and they kind of tread water that way. And if you don't understand that, then you can't really work on it, because you're going to. I recently saw an interview with one of these people. I believe it was with Lou Elizondo, and the interviewer obviously thought that he would have all of the secret knowledge dating back for years, and he doesn't have any of it because it's not written down. None of it exists. So the curveball was, I wanted to talk to one of the military people who I discuss in the book about a certain meeting. And he said, well, I disagree with you entirely. It never happened. But it did happen. And I can prove that it happened. But that was a curveball, because I didn't expect him to say that. It's not a secret anymore. It's obviously out there, but he's just so used to keeping it secret. Or maybe he's even obligated to say that under the law. I don't know, even though it's right out there in public. So now I have this to deal with. One of the principal participants in the meeting claims it never happened. That's a curveball.
That's a curveball, but you're still standing in the batter's box, and there's another pitch coming. So
That's
what are you
right.
gonna how are you going to manage that one?
Well, I'm going to try to avoid making the next pitch a beanball. That's what I'm going to do.
That's a good
No,
one.
I'm just going to state that I'm not going to use his name, and I'm just going to state that some of the participants in the meeting are still maintaining that it didn't happen. But
Okay.
I think it's clear that it did.
Can you access what's known as the Akashic record?
You know, that's an interesting question. I've wondered about whether or not things like that even exist. I'm too sort of innately, I mean, of all people to say they're innately skeptical, it's just, I know it's ridiculous, but in fact, I am innately skeptical. And I wouldn't say I understood what that was, but I will say this, that the people who did claim to access it fluently, like Edgar Cayce, said a lot of things that were totally wrong. So I don't know what to make of it. I don't know whether it's the Akashic record or the Akashic imagination.
Well, I'm skeptical also. I got to be able to see it. So I asked that because I thought you might be able to access information about that meeting through other means.
Well, that would be true, but that's also part of the story we're not going to tell right now. I can tell you another story about writing a book called In Hitler's House.
In Hitler's house?
In Hitler's House. It was a spy novel that I wanted to write, and I started it in 2015, a few months after Annie passed away, because I wanted to get my mind into another world. And it involved, the novel is written as a faux memoir. In other words, it's a memoir written in the 1970s by a man, a young German-American man who fell in with Hitler on a trip to Germany in 1931, realized how dangerous he was as he became a close friend of Hitler's, and ended up spying on Hitler from the inside throughout the entire war, basically as a loyal human being, loyal to his humanity and to the United States and Western freedom and so forth. But it had to be, if you're going to write a faux memoir, it has to have the taste of the times. It has to be written as if this was a person who casually knew what kind of gum people chewed, the brand names of collars that they used to use, how the gasoline smelled in those days. He had to have all of that there. And this whole business of coincidence just worked overtime. It was like the book was practice for the rest of my life, because what would happen would be, for example, he was intimate with Hitler in the sense that, you know, they would go to Hitler's country house together before Hitler became the chancellor, and after too, but they would sort of hang out together. And what does that mean? He would know things like what kind of toothpaste Hitler used. Now, how would I find that out? Because I didn't want to make it up. I wanted it to be from the source. And lo and behold, one day I found that my Google had turned to German when I was typing in things like Hitler toothpaste and not expecting much of an answer. And I thought, okay, I don't speak German. So I translated it back, and it turned out that there was a book written, a little book written by one of Hitler's valets. And apparently it was in this book, but the book's never been translated into English. It was in German. So I went on the German Amazon and bought it, and it came, and it was in German. And I went to a dinner the night it came with some friends, and I mentioned that I was working on this and that I had this book by Hitler's valet, and I said, and unfortunately, it's in German. I can't read a word of it. And one of the guests piped up with, "Oh, I'm fluent in German. Give it to me. I'll tell you everything. I'll translate it for you." So there you have it. And I found out what kind of toothpaste Hitler used. I also found out his breath was so bad he brushed his teeth 6 times a day. And that's a combination of, the way this weave kind of works. It's fascinating to me.
Yeah, it's really it's riding a roller coaster. I think it's like
Yeah.
it's a fun ride, and I'm getting a much clearer idea about how your mind is like an information vacuum, looking for particular pieces of stuff out there, and
Yeah.
you have it in mind, and then it shows up in various ways. Again,
That's exactly right.
and that's a fundamentally common coincidence pattern, but you take it to one of the furthest extremes that I've had the pleasure of hearing someone describe.
Interesting. I did not realize that.
Yeah, it's just that you've got that on steroids. That information I needed, it shows up, kind of thing, in funny ways and in interesting ways, and it's pleasurable to do that. I was looking for a way to explain internal GPS with the brain, or at least partly, and I was flipping around and got to the New York Times front page somehow, and there was an answer about the hippocampus and the CA3 area in the hippocampus that helps know where we are in space, at least rats and probably human beings too. So it's really fun to have answers to your questions come up, but the fundamental for me is it shows how closely your mind is connected to your environment and how responsive it is. It brings us back to your question about the personnel and policies of our visitors. Are they here to help us, or are they here to do something else? And what you're describing that you're able to do with coincidences is be helped by these events that come together when you need them, but you're not so sure about the visitors. And let me give you an example of a visitor that I love the X-Men, the Marvel comic series. I like some Marvel things, but I love the X-Men. I'm reading the First Class now, the prequel to what happened with Professor X, how he got to be Professor X. And these mutants have funny eyes. They don't necessarily have black eyes, but they have funny eyes. And they begin to resemble like some of the things you're describing. There's something weird about them, but they look like other people. And these are the strangers among us. These are the them. And in a way, I'm more like them. I'm a kind of a mutant myself in being able to understand and use coincidences. And so are you. It's more subtle, but you are a high frequency coincider, Whitley. You
I
are
couldn't work without it.
you,
It's the core of my work process.
the core of your work process.
Yeah, absolutely. And by the way, I don't know if you've read Jeff Kripal's work on the X-Men. He's
I
really interested. He's got some fascinating things to say about the X-Men. You should definitely pick up his book, Mutants and Mystics.
I had it somewhere and read it. I loved it.
Yeah, it's a good book. And I had X-Men #1 for a long time, and I sold it. So I sold it because I needed the money. But
you needed the money. Well, that's a good reason to sell it.
Yeah, I bought it for like $600 and sold it for quite a bit more than that.
Well, there's something special about the X-Men that's separate from like the Green Lantern and the other characters, because each person has a talent and they come together to try to do something good. And that's where I'm looking. That's where I'm looking. You are part of a quiet group that is trying to use coincidences to further humanity in some way or other. And so am
Yeah,
I.
because
And
the universe is willing to help.
Yes.
Whatever's out there, the consciousness external to the body is just definitely willing to step up if you want it to.
If you wanted to, if you're open to it, if you
Yeah.
let it come into you by putting yourself in the right position to ask for it and be ready for it. So there's this openness and activity that allows the process to happen, and the belief in it. And for you, it's more than belief, it's a need.
It's essential because, I want to work. I have work to do. And my writing is my life. I have to, and this is what I do. I'm thinking about my next book already and trying to figure out, I have an idea and it seems to me to be completely impossible to write, which is probably
Which is good.
which is
why
exactly
you want to do it.
why I want to do it. Exactly.
Well, when I was in medical school, I had this idea that I wanted to use moving through the world, my moving through the world, as a pen to write a story about something. I didn't know what it was. And that's what I'm doing now. The coincidences help me write the story of coincidences. That's how I got to this. You are a pen in the hands of something that it has something to do with you, that is writing stories through you.
That is definitely how it feels. And I think that one of the most important things is something that we overlook completely, which is attention. You have to have a very strong, orderly, and functional attention, not an attention that just goes wherever the next thing is. In other words, our attentions mostly just go out to whatever is happening around us. But if you maintain an orderly attention and you retain some of it while you're living in the flow of the world, and you are watching yourself function, this is the part of your attention has to watch yourself in function.
Yes.
And then is when that part picks up all the coincidences. That's the vacuum cleaner you were talking about. It will pick up that stuff. You'll notice then.
You are so right. And I hope maybe you're right about your coincidences one of these days, just to step back. I call this observer of you in action the self-observer.
Yep, that's exactly what it is, precisely.
And the self-observer is doing just what you so beautifully described. It's watching, seeing things, and remembering some of it. You can't remember all of it. But I think you have a coincidence sensitivity button in your head that gets pushed by certain connections between what's in your mind and what's out there. It goes bong and says, Whitley, remember this one, and you pack it away somewhere in your mind, in your brain, wherever that goes.
There's an interesting book by a man named Julian Jaynes called The Origins of Consciousness and the Breakdown of the Bicameral Mind. Not the most scintillating title ever conceived, but the idea is that there was a time when we didn't really have minds like we do now, that all we had was the part that lived, as we're discussing, by coincidence and inference. And only later, when we began to assemble a lot of information, that what he calls consciousness, and I would say was better called intellect, began to evolve. And it's a really interesting thing, because he was right, I'm pretty sure. And if you realize that you can live in a different way, where you balance this bicameralism with intellect, you use both, your mind is much more powerful than it would otherwise be.
Just what I was watching a video about yesterday.
You're kidding. Tell me about the video. I'm fascinated.
The video was there's there's part one of the mind or part two, or yeah, that one and two, something or other. And one is the intuitive one, as he called it then. And the other is the rational one. And being able to use the rational mind to hone the intuitive mind that is full of creativity, but sometimes wrong. So you test out your intuition with your rationality. It's being an internal scientist and seeing if what your intuition came up with fits with what you need at that moment, or fits what with reality seems to be. That honing of intuition is a central part of being able to use coincidences effectively.
You know, that gets me back to the Akashic record in Edgar Cayce, or I think it's Casey is the way he pronounced
Casey
yeah.
Jones.
And he trusted his intuition too much. In other words, he didn't compare it. He didn't use his reason at all. He just made the intuitive leaps and wrote this vast amount of material, some of which is extraordinary, much of which is wrong. And this is true of again and again when you read psychic mediums and channeled material. There's not much that isn't like that. Some of it is all wrong, of course, but none of it is all completely right. And you know, I'm talking about, and there's also a tendency to see the future darkly that is endemic in the whole process. I'll give you an example, and I'm hoping I'll remember the name of the book, which I may or may not happen. I'm not sure, because it's coming. This is coming to me. There is a discovery that's been made by doctors Gary Nolan and Christopher Green, who work on intuitives and brains and the brain. And they have discovered that there's in the executive function of the brain, where there are the caudate and the putamen, there's white matter between them that links them. And people who are psychically sensitive or highly intuitive or can do things like remote viewing have very dense linkages between the two, abnormally dense linkages. And this idea appears in channeled material in a book that was written in 1963, and which is absolutely remarkable. It's
the idea of the connection between the putamen and the
caudate, exactly, in channel material. And you'd think, oh my God, this must be one of the most powerful psychics that ever existed. I got the book, and it's a total mishmash of failed prophecies, except for that.
So he got one element of it right and the rest of it not.
And the rest of it, all of this whole lifetime of prophecies, wrong. And I'm going to, while we're talking, I'm going to sneak into eBay and see if I can remember help, because I want the viewers and listeners to know the title of this book.
And so, as you're sneaking around, I'm going to mention Edgar Cayce, because his institute is in Virginia Beach, not far from where I live, and I've always had a suspicion about something that didn't seem right about Edgar Cayce and all the people who thought that anything he said was wonderful. And now you're clarifying what my theme for the last 2 days is sharpening intuition with rationality from you and for what I got yesterday. And that's what you call your skeptic. It's not a skeptic, really. It's somebody who wants to test out ideas, not just accept them because they came through an intuitive channel.
Right. And we have that precise thing that you have to open the intuitive channel and be sure it's there and be sure it's open by using your attention in the way I described earlier. But then you have to kind of take it with a grain of salt, don't you? Because
Yes.
if you trust it too much, it's definitely going to
Throw you off. You're
disappoint
going to
you.
be wrong. And
Yeah,
what I want to go back to is your mind in a web and my mind in a different but parallel web. And your question about how does it work? And a good science starts with good description. And that's why I'm not trying to make too many guesses about how it works, except that our mind and our environment are much more connected than we know. And then to be
right.
able to see how that web functions by looking at the coincidences. You are a wonderful example of a high frequency coincider, that you live these things because that's what you need. You need coincidences to be able to do the work that you do. So you become, we take you into a spaceship, we examine your mind. Well, this spaceship will be right here between you and me, but that's what I'm doing, is listening to how you think and how you experience, because you are a paradigmatic example of what I study. And I think that's fun.
Well, that's interesting. By the way, I did find the book.
Go
It's
ahead.
Through the Curtain by Viola Pettit Neal. And I wouldn't, it's not available for in published form anymore. It's long since out of print. But that was the name of the book anyway. I wouldn't recommend getting it because you're not going to find anything much in it except that one thing.
What we found was what you found, which was very important in all this. Let me, as we get near the end of this, Whitley, talk about the content of intuition. What's in there? Because the term intuition is used in so many different ways because there's so many different contents coming through. I want to focus on what might be called the parapsychological aspects of coincidence, of what's in the intuition. And be able to say, as I was just thinking this morning, that's why I look at what I got here, is that there are various channels that come into our intuitive knowing. And we call sometimes them clairvoyance, telepathy. I have the term simulpathity. You were like seeing here with, when I was talking to you on your podcast, you saw a bug floating around here that reminded you of your deceased wife, who has this that
Moth,
moth,
yeah.
the white moth thing.
Yeah.
Those are forms of communication from our intuition, as
Right.
well as clairaudition. So I was just thinking today, is like, why do we have to break it all up? There, just like we have five senses in this kind of rational world of ours, we also have at least five senses for our intuition, and there are various channels through which information comes to us. What do you think of that?
What I think of that is two things. First, it sounds like it has a ring of truth to it. And second, I think understanding it could be a very powerful tool in honing it and making it work for you.
Yes. And that starts
yeah.
with defining it or describing it as well as we can.
Exactly. That's exactly right. Because once we have it described in such a way that, intuition is like a kind of a conceptual breeze blowing. It's very fragile. And if you look at it too hard, it's gonna go into your imagination immediately. But if you kind of look at it kind of out of the corner of your eye, then you're gonna get something out of it.
Well, I've gotten a lot out of this one, Whitley, talking with you. I really
thanks.
have.
I have too. It's been very enjoyable.
It's parallel. Very enjoyable talking with you. I like that I can talk with you with my heart and my mind. On the Zoom. I just like that. It just feels.
Me too. Me too. It's very enjoyable. I really enjoyed talking with you. I had a lot of fun on my show too. On Dreamland, we had a blast.
We did.
Yeah,
we did. We had a good time. So I will take this time to say au revoir, and we got to meet again somewhere, Whitley. It's just too much fun, and I don't know how to do that, but
we will.
We'll figure
It'll
out.
happen.
we'll figure out something. It's just too much fun. And more than the fun of it, I call fun is when you're doing something that's play and you're learning at the same time. Fun
Right.
is learning and playing. And that's
Real work is play.
real work is play. So work is play and learning and doing. And we played, we worked. We'll do it again. Thank you very
And both
much.
of us are going to get a rich reward from this show. Our coincidence meters are going to be flying back and forth all day.
You're right.
Yeah.
You're right.
Thank you.
And thank you.
This psychosphere is our mental atmosphere, like a hologram of cosmic consciousness.